I'm an associate professor in the Department of Soil, Water and Climate at the University of Minnesota. And I would like to welcome you today to this 18th William Larson and Raymond Almera's Emerging Issues in Soil and Water lecture. The lecture series began in 2003 thanks to the generous donations and support of Professors Will Larson and Ray Merced and their families, as well as other donors that provide a forum with this lecture to discuss emerging issues, to inspire creative thinking, and to recognize excellence in the broad area of agriculture research with a specific emphasis on soil and water. We are also happy to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Asmeret Asefaw Berhe, who was scheduled to speak with us in 2020, but unfortunately we had to cancel that event, but we are fortunate to have her with us today. We have invited her to give two talks. The first one will be on the science, the research that she's doing that is pretty awesome in the effects of fire and organic carbon in soils. And then the second will be on diversity and equity in soil and climate science. And both of these will be, there will be time for discussions and to talk afterwards. I would like to take a moment to thank the committee members that helped with the plan and organization of this lecture. The organizing committee includes Paul Capel, Jane Johnson, Diana Carwin, Lindsay Pease, Gary Sands, Jeff Strzok, Bruce Wilson, Melissa Wilson, Carol Rosen, and Amy Gillespie. Also, thank you to Amy Gillespie and Meredith Wire for their technical assistance during this day. Before we go into introducing the speaker, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Greg Cuomo. He's the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Programs in the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources Sciences.
Thank you, Fabian. And I'd like to also welcome everybody, but I'd also like to thank the family and friends of William Larson and Ray Merced for enabling this Emerging Issues in Soil and Water lecture series. Fabian alluded to it even with this program, but we all know that 2020 was a challenging year for in very many ways. But this is also true at the university. Those of us who work in CFANS know the effort it took to deliver all the classes online in a few days' notice, and how to develop the processes and procedures to conduct work in a safe and responsible way. To be honest, at the university, we all know our faculty and staff could do it. But in short, they showed the real commitment to students and the land grant mission that we're built upon. So with that, I thought, well, what has this Department of Soil, Water, Climate been doing in the last year? I have just a few examples. Nick Jelinski and Jay Bell adapted their new introductory soils course to be all online and include labs in truly an excellent and accessible way. And because it was an online offering, they were able to expand it to crop professionals. And so it expanded their opportunity for impact. And in fact, we might take that model again and are thinking about delivering it in Southwest Minnesota with a hands-on lab offered at the Southwest Research Station in Lamberton as an experiment in expanding access and opportunities to education in rural Minnesota. With that, the Extension Nutrient Management team effectively altered their programming to do all online formats in the past year without missing a beat in terms of offering and quality of programs. It's a critical group in helping producers grow crops in a profitable and environmentally sustainable way. In terms of research, in 2020, soil, water, and climate researchers got 58 grant awards totaling over $12 million. Almost $10 million of that came from federal and private sources. So if you think about that, that's over a 4-to-1 leverage in state and commodity group funding from the faculty and researchers in that department. Those grants were across a very wide range of topics that sort of talk about what that department really does. Everything from earthworms to oceans, manure to cover crops to erosion to changes in air and air quality. But really 2020 is past us and it's time to look for the future. In CFANS in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, we're actually very excited about that future, what we can do, but most importantly, the positive impact we can have on shaping a sustainable future where all people of the world are nourished and our natural resources are enhanced. That's the challenge in CFANS, but it's also the challenge in our global society. When I see the students, staff, and faculty in this department in the college, I realize that in spite of the challenges of 2020, and in spite of the challenges that we will certainly face in the future around food, agriculture, and natural resources, we have much to be optimistic about. I'd like to welcome you again to today's seminar, and I hope you are looking forward to it as much as I am. And Fabian, I think the next speaker is Dr. Carl Rosen, department head. Is that correct?
Well, yes, thanks, Dr. Cuomo. Actually, Carl will not be able to be here today due to a family situation that just is a very brand new development. Unfortunately, he will not be here, but he did send some notes that I would like to read on his behalf. So this is what Carl wrote. On behalf of the department, welcome to the 18th Larsen Almaraz lecture. Due to unforeseen circumstances, I will not be able to attend this year. However, I want you to know that this lecture series is always a highlight of the year for our department, and this year is no exception. Hopefully, we will get to do this in person next year. A lot has happened in the department since our last Larsen Almaraz lecture in 2019. Despite the pandemic, we have continued with our research, teaching, and outreach missions. Most classes and extension programs have been taught online. Assuming all goes well, plans are to reopen this coming fall semester for in-person classes. I would like to highlight one recent award. Dylan Millett was selected to receive a distinguished McKnight professorship. This prestigious award recognizes outstanding faculty members who have recently achieved full professor status. We are very proud of Dylan's accomplishment. In the other department news, Ed Nader, our former department head, retired this past January after 35 years in the department. We hope to have a retirement party for him after the pandemic is over. Marjorie Bonsi, our administrative director, also retired in January after 35 years in the department. We had her retirement party over Zoom last December. We hired Nicole Smiley to take over part of Marjorie's responsibilities. Nicole's previous position was with the law school as an associate administrator. She is also working 50% time with the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics, so she's a very busy person. Stacy Nordstrom, our former communications specialist, who helped with this lecture series, moved to another position at the university last April. We hired Amy Gillespie to take her place, and I have to say we have not missed a beat. In terms of new faculty members since 2019, we were fortunate to be able to replace Mark Seeley's position and hire Heidi Roop as our new extension climate scientist. Heidi comes to us from the University of Washington, where she was the lead scientist for climate communication for the Climate Impacts Group in the College of the Environment. Heidi will continue applying research related to climate change and develop an extension program to communicate climate information useful for decision-making in agriculture production, forestry, and management of natural resources. We were also fortunate to hire Dr. Peter Neff as an assistant research professor. Peter also comes here from the University of Washington, where he was a postdoctoral researcher associate working with trace gases on ice cores from the Antarctica to evaluate climate change in the past and what it could mean for climate change in the future. He will continue his work on climate change in his position here in Minnesota. Finally, we are happy to be joined by members of the Larsen family and the Almaraz family on the call with us today, and greatly appreciate their support of this lecture series. And I would say from the Larsen family, Steve Larsen, Alice Lai are present, and I would like to hand over to Colleen Adamo, daughter of Ray Almaraz, is calling from Northern California. She will share a few words and introduce the members of the Almares family. So, Colleen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Almares Adamu. I am the youngest child of Ray Almares. I'd like to introduce my siblings and family that are joining with us today for this event. First, I'd like to introduce my older sisters and Ray's daughters, Joan from Oklahoma, Kathy from Washington State, Mary from Colorado, and my older brother Steve and his wife Lori from Washington State. I'd like to introduce my nephews and Ray's grandsons, Paul from Oklahoma, Scott and Anthony from Colorado, and Rashid and Razak from California. I also want to give a shout out to my aunts and uncles and cousins joining from the Twin Cities areas and Seattle area and Colorado Springs area. On behalf of the Almares family, I would like to thank Carl, Fabian, Greg, and the committee for the opportunity to attend and participate in the Emerging Issues in Soil and Water series once again this year. We would like to extend a thank you to the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate for setting up the lecture series back in 2003 to honor Bill and our father. We know that our dad was very humbled by this honor and would be proud that it is still continuing after 19 years. We are grateful to Fabian and the committee for your efforts this year to coordinate and host the lecture. Each year we enjoy being part of the gathering of academia and scientists to learn and discuss a wide range of topics, including and related to soil and water and the associated aspects of the science. The topic this year of post-fire erosion strikes very close to home for me. I've lived with my family north of San Francisco for the past 23 years. 3 years ago, we were woken in the middle of the night to thick smoke, power outage, and violent winds. We fled our house to escape the incoming fires. Our house did not burn, but the fire consumed more than 5,000 homes and took 25 lives within a 5-mile radius of our home. The fire burned so hot that there was nothing left of the houses, and the foundations would even need to be removed. In some places, the fire moved through quickly, and others it decimated the landscape. And of course, this is just what we could see. The subsequent leaching of toxins, erosion, and potential for flash floods would follow. The impacts of fires on soils would have intrigued my father. My sister Joan recalls visiting Yellowstone with Dad in the fall of 1989, a year after the devastating fires of 1988. While driving between Norris Geyser Basin and Canyon Village, Dad, always the scientist, requested that Joan pull off on a non-entrance small service road so that he could actually get out and examine the soil in the burnt out areas of the North Fork Fire. Following were discussions on changes in the soil and thoughts on experiments Dad would have liked to pursue. In 2004, 15 years later, they again drove through that same area, but this time with 2 grandsons. But unfortunately for Dad, it was pouring down rain, and another stop to look at the soils was vetoed by all in the car. Just last year, California had the biggest fire on record. The August complex in Northern California burnt over 1 million acres and lasted 4 months. While the fire was mostly in forested areas, the impact on the soils and the downstream ecosystem has to be immense. Since the increasing fire intensity year after year is the result of climate change, it's interesting that scientists such as Dr. Berhe are enlightening us to the further impact of fire on the soil's ability to store carbon. In sum up, the good news for those of you that enjoy California wines, most of the vineyards in Sonoma and Napa Valleys have survived the fires for the past 3 years, but maybe the real concern here is our healthy soils surviving. And with that, I hand back to Fabian.
Thanks, Colleen, and thank you very much to you and to your family for being here. As you highlighted, the research that Dr. Berhe and others are doing is so important to address some of the conditions and the situations that you described. I would like now to introduce our invited speaker. Dr. Asmeret Berhe is Professor of Soil Biogeochemistry and Falasco Chair in Earth Sciences at the Department of Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of California, Merced. She's recipient of several awards and honors, including Fellow and Joanne Simpson Medal recipient from the American Geophysical Union, Fellow and Bramery Award recipient from the Geological Society of America, the National Science Foundation's Career Award, and is a member of the inaugural class of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's New Voices in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We are also very excited to also mention that yesterday we heard an announcement from President Biden that she's been nominated as the director of the Office of Science in the Department of Energy. So we are very fortunate to have Dr. Berhe with us, and we are very eager to hear your experiences and the research that you have been conducting. So with that, Asmeret, please take it over.
Thank you so much, Fabian, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I guess I should say midday for you all. It's an honor for me to join you today and share the kind of work that we do at our lab here at the University of California, Merced. But before I go any further, I just want to say how honored I am to be this year's speaker. I thank Fabian, Jess, Dana, and everyone in the department for selecting me and inviting me to join you. Of course, the Larson and Almers family members for making it possible and joining us today. It's really an honor to be able to be part of the event that is being held at the university. I regret, obviously, that we weren't able to do this in person last year, but you know, this is what this year gave us. So at least we're glad we can get together like this. I'm glad it could work. So I'll talk to you all about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab with the effect of fire on soil conditions. I'm particularly going to talk about the post-fire erosion, and that is enhanced by fires, typically in fire-affected ecosystems. And in particular, how it affects the charred remains of biomass, char, what we refer to as pyrogenic carbon to imply that it's been altered by heat treatment. What happens to that after fire? But I'll start with a bit of a general introduction on effects of fire and what we've been seeing in California first. So again, without going any further, I would like to highlight that obviously one doesn't do this much work by themselves. I'm very fortunate to have been able to work with some phenomenal scientists, students, and postdocs in my career. And for this part in particular, I want to highlight two graduate students and a postdoc that I was a mentor for. Very fortunate to be their mentor, Rebecca, Samuel, and Fernanda. They did so much of the work that I'm going to present today as part of their thesis and other projects in my lab at the University of California, Merced. I also have to recognize some wonderful collaborators that I've been able to work with over the years and funding that we received in particular from the National Science Foundation and the National Park Service to enable this work. And since many of you, I don't know me and I don't know you, I thought I should start with a little bit about what we do in our lab. So I'm the lead principal investigator for the soil biogeochemistry lab at UC Merced. And in our lab, we study the biogeochemical cycles of essential elements, in particular in soil. We have a particular focus on carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycling, these really incredible and essential elements. We do that with a focus on trying to improve our understanding of soil health and processes that are responsible for maintaining a soil health, but we also have a focus on climate change impacts and mitigation. In particular, in our lab, we've been able to focus on a few really important processes. So what happens when there is a rather sudden and significant physical change in the environment? Some things that happen with erosion and lateral redistribution of topsoil with erosion and how that affects these cycles, but also how fire and charring of the biomass because of fire affects the biogeochemical cycles. We study how global change effects of these essential cycles and processes too, in particular impacts of increasing atmospheric temperature, and also impacts of changing amount, timing, and even distribution of precipitation in the Earth's surface, and how that affects critical soil processes. I have a background and a master's degree in political ecology, and that is also quite handy when we like to think about broader soil and human interactions, and how the overuse and abuse of soil by human communities affects the soil system, but also how that comes back then to affect human well-being, food and nutritional security, obviously, but even things like human security overall and national security type of considerations. And in everything that we do in our lab, we try to instill principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We do this not just as we select and welcome everyone to be able to join us in this amazing scientific journeys, but we also do it even implement these principles as we select the topics we study, and even how we study them and how we choose to communicate the results of our work. So this is a very important principle in our lab. Okay. And I'll spend a lot of time talking about this particular pool of carbon today, pyrogenic carbon. So before going any further, I thought I should give you a brief introduction into what this pool of carbon is. So when I'm talking about pyrogenic carbon or pyrogenic matter, sometimes we refer to it as black carbon or char, we're referring to basically partial combustion products of biomass. So this is what happens when biomass is exposed to fire and high temperature treatments and is converted to either char or ash. The distinction here between char and ash is at what temperature it was altered. Ash is produced at much higher temperatures than char. And when you look at the chemical structures of pyrogenic carbon, typically it's made out of condensed aromatic structures. So these rings, ring structures of organic compounds that are made out of these ring-like structures coming together. And they typically form graphene-like sheets like you see here. And when they're coming together in a 3D structure, then they're able to come together in a very porous, highly porous structure that is also very light in density. And this highlights, this really nice figure here highlights how biomass changes from what we recognize as wood or litter as it's exposed to high temperatures, how it changes in terms of its what we call it, as well as its composition. So the idea being that, biomass exposed to fairly low temperature fire conditions is going to be slightly charred biomass, might even be bigger pieces. But at high temperatures, you generate things like ash and even soot, and ultimately graphitic material. That is kind of really, chemically speaking, pretty hard to break down in the environment, at least initially. And the reason why this particular pool of carbon of all the carbon that's in soil is becoming an important focus in our work is because a lot of the work in the last 10, 15 years is demonstrating that something like 13 to 35% of all the carbon in soil can actually have been altered by fire at one point or another. And if that's true, and we're increasingly believing that it is actually a pretty good estimate, then we have to do some large-scale rethinking about how we thought about how fast organic matter cycles in the soil system. Because remember what I said, that this char is made out of these condensed aromatic structures, meaning multiple rings coming together is what that condensed terminology is referring to. And chemically speaking, it's a bit hard compound to break down. Microbes can break it down over time, but initially speaking, it's much harder to break down these condensed aromatic structures than, say, cellulose or glucose, which are are simple organic compounds in the environment that are dominant in leaves. So, but if what we're saying now then is that a good amount, a third or so of all the soil carbon is fire altered, then we have to reassess how fast we think carbon cycles in the Earth system, because this material has a potential of persisting for considerably longer in soil than fire not treated biomass or wood or litter. And I'm going to come back to this point and tell you about what proportion of the carbon in the sites we studied is actually pyrogenic, and you'll see it in a minute. And then I thought I should also talk a little bit about fires generally, right? In the Western US in particular, the amount, intensity, and the land area affected by fires continues to increase. The figure that you're seeing is cumulative burn area in the last 2 decades. In 2020, for example, more than 10 million acres of land was burned in the US in something like 60,000 individual fires. There was more area burned in 2020 than any other year before. And, as some of you, I'm sure, have been following in the news, in the western part of the US, the fires just keep breaking their records every year at this point. And this is also kind of true globally. There's a global land area that's burning roughly at about 3 to 8 million kilometers square per year. So fires are becoming quite significant, and drying and climate change are contributing to this drought, I should say. And fire as a whole is also a very important controller of soil carbon dynamics, partly because fires burn biomass, right? That is either standing biomass or the dead biomass that is on the surface of soils, and organic matter that's found light on the surface of soils. And as it burns this biomass, it releases quite a lot of carbon into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. In fact, it's estimated that the net greenhouse gas emissions from fire roughly contribute to about 6% of all the CO2 emission that's occurring to the atmosphere right now. And this is true in California, where this is becoming an even bigger issue, and the contribution of fire to CO2 release to the atmosphere just continues to rise over time. I work with wonderful colleagues at UC Merced who have been doing some groundbreaking work on how changing climate is exacerbating the amount and severity of fires that are occurring in the western part of the US. And this is from their work that has shown that, for example, since the mid-1980s, especially in the western part of the US, including California, we've seen higher large wildfires frequency, longer wildfire duration, and longer wildfire seasons. And this is some clearly related, as you could see in this figure from one of John Abatsgu, our colleague at UC Merced's papers, that this is really related with fuel aridity, or how dry the biomass and the forest especially is getting during summer months, in particular in California. And as you could see, the red dots concentrating on the top part of the figure here also is an indication that this problem is getting worse in the recent decades compared to the prior decades of 1980s to 1999. And so this problem is important, but it's also getting worse over time in places like California. So, ecologists, soil scientists, environmental scientists in general have been studying fires for long periods of time and their impacts in ecosystems. And fires have a number of impacts on ecosystems, including, as you could see here, the destruction and combustion of vegetation, and also altering the chemical and physical properties, as well as the microbial community dynamics at or very close to the soil surface. And a lot of times, that's really been how we've been studying soils, largely speaking, in academic literature. But lately, not just me, but multiple people have been trying to refocus our efforts into the additional impacts of fire on soil processes. And by that, I'm referring to the loss of large amounts of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, essential nutrients that occurs when biomass and topsoil burns in especially wildfire type conditions. All of these are pictures we took after the really major fire that went through Yosemite National Park, the Rimfire, in 2003. And we're also recognizing now that there is a lot of pyrogenic matter, this char that is formed and deposited at the soil surface immediately after fires. We are also recognizing now that there is large amount of carbon dioxide and particulate black carbon that gets released into the atmosphere every time fires happen. And the increasing severity of fires means that there is now increasing amount of CO2 and particulate black carbon or pyrogenic carbon that's getting released to the atmosphere every year. Add to that the fact that fires, when they burn, they create quite fundamental change in soil physical and chemical properties. First of all, they take away the vegetation cover that protects the soil surface from erosion and other impacts, because when there is vegetation cover in the ground, as you can imagine, it slows down the impact of rainfall. It provides organic matter and roots and facilitates fungal abundance that all of them create stabilizing conditions for soil. They form aggregates. They add nutrients to soil. So all of these things are really helpful in terms of maintenance of soil health. But when fires take away the vegetation cover, obviously the topsoil becomes vulnerable to degradation. One of the really important changes that occur with fire is that combustion of biomass releases volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere. And rather soon after the fire, as the soil surfaces start cooling, some of these volatile organic compounds that are released into the atmosphere come down, get redeposited on the soil surface. But these compounds are made out of lipids and other things that actually make it hard for water to penetrate in soil. So they reduce wettability is what it's called. They're, in chemistry terms, what we call hydrophobic compounds. They resist formation of water, hydrogen bonds between water and the particles that are on the soil surface. And what that means really is that they restrict flow, a vertical downward flow of water and infiltration of water into the soil surface. And when you're working in, kind of rather steep hill slopes that look like this, if water after precipitation cannot penetrate vertically downward, it has to go laterally, right? When it goes laterally, then it takes all the topsoil and litter and charred material that is on the surface with it. And this is partly responsible for why you have large increases in erosion post-fire, because the fire creates these hydrophobic compounds that restrict wettability of the soil and restrict infiltration of water that causes large mass movement events, including erosion. And we've written a number of reviews and data papers on this topic over the years, but instead of kind of belaboring this point more so that we can focus on others, I'll just leave these two references of review and synthesis and commentary on the topic for all to see here. But I just want to mention that one of the really wonderful things for us as we started this work was, being able to observe and learn from people who've been doing this kind of work historically, especially people like McDonald, who is this phenomenal scientist who recently retired from Colorado State University. He spent a lot of time in his career learning about post-fire erosion and erosion in natural forest ecosystems in particular. And Lee and others had documented over the years. They took these kind of really phenomenal pictures that make it very clear to demonstrate what we're talking about and the importance of this work. So what you see in this kind of cartoonish representation is obviously that when precipitation happens in the absence of fire, especially in places like the Sierra Nevada, that you have porous weakly developed soils, but there's a lot of organic matter from the forest ecosystems that the water rather easily infiltrates into the soil surface, and most of the water is then moved through subsurface flow mechanisms to reach streams and go downhill, basically. But after fires, because fires, first of all, remove the vegetation, they create the hydrophobic conditions that I mentioned. When infiltration is restricted, then the fire takes, kind of a different route and moves laterally. And as it does, it takes some of that, kind of material that's on the surface with it. And then it deposits all this charred material in streams. And that's exactly what Lee was, kind of demonstrating over the years with some of the data that he collected, but also these kind of pictures that he saw. And this was really wonderful as we started thinking about these topics, because there's a global group of scientists also who've been thinking about this pyrogenic carbon cycle, trying to improve our understanding of how this cycle plays out in general. And one of the things they did was they put together a couple of really nice reviews. This is one of them, but there's another one in Annual Reviews written by Michael Bird. That's also really wonderful for people who want to study pyrogenic carbon cycles. And lucky for us, this paper came out as one of my students who was studying this in this area. It was actually getting ready to wrap up her dissertation research, and we were fortunate to be able to have really nice working relationship with Christina Santing and others it's just, kind of wonderful timing to basically demonstrate. What they did here is they reconstructed. This is one of the best reconstructions that we have of what the pyrogenic carbon cycle looks like, right? How much pyrogenic carbon is generated by fires, how much of it is released to the atmosphere, how much of it stays in soil, but how much of it also then is laterally transported. And this is important because soil scientists and marine sediments, scientists who study marine sediments historically had, documented that there is a lot of pyrogenic carbon in soil. They've, atmospheric scientists documented there's a lot of pyrogenic carbon in soot. Marine scientists did the same, but the linkage between these three things was missing. The role of transport in determining the fate of pyrogenic carbon was missing. And so Christina, in this paper that they published, and her team, put together this figure with all these question marks that basically allude to how much we don't know about what happens to this pyrogenic carbon as it's moving through the Earth system. What factors govern its movement? Does its decomposition rate get altered in the process during the transport or soon after? What proportion of it moves in dissolved forms or particulate forms? These were all missing gaps, and missing gaps that fit wonderfully with the work that we were doing at the time, because we were exactly dealing with these kinds of questions in a project that was funded by NSF about a couple of years prior. So perfect timing then to demonstrate, how the need for why we need to fill in these really critical gaps in our understanding of pyrogenic carbon cycles. And I think this is a demonstration of, how important these processes are overall. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a lot of data, but I'm going to try to organize. I tried to organize it in three kind of sections. First, I'll tell you a little bit about from our work how fires alter soil, and I put fires in quotation marks here because we wanted to control the conditions that fire was happening. Obviously, you can't control what wildfires doing out there, but we wanted to understand how temperature treatment of topsoil alters soil organic matter. So we created our own simulated heating treatments to mimic what's likely to happen with fires in the lab. And I want to make sure we keep acknowledging that these fire conditions in quotation mark in the lab are really just heat treatments, right? So I'm not saying they're exactly identical to what fires do in the environment, but they give us a good approximation. So I'm going to tell you how that affects particulate organic matter and the water extractable portion of organic matter. And then because those are really important when you think about transport separately. And then I'm going to tell you about how two important variables in how erosion happens in the land surface, in particular slope and the severity of fire, control the post-fire erosion overall for soil and also for the organic matter and pyrogenic carbon that's transported by fire. And then we'll get into a little bit of why is this such an important topic in our understanding of pyrogenic carbon, how erosion affects the persistence of pyrogenic carbon in the soil system. So to start with the heating on particulate dissolved organic matter. So for this, we wanted to capture, the impact of fire on a range of different types of soils. And so we live in the Central Valley of California, which is right next to the Sierra Nevada mountains. And we were able to work with wonderful colleagues at the UC Davis, in particular, Randy Dahlgren, who's super generous with his information on sites that he had studied previously to help us identify and trace the locations of these soils, because these soils are he did incredible work over the years to demonstrate how climate, as it changed along the elevation sequence on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, how that also creates distinctly different types of soils. And so these soils have different levels of development. They have different amounts of organic matter, different types of minerals, even though they were developed from similar parent material, in similar environments, but by virtue of experiencing different climatic conditions have become very different types of soils, ranging from inceptisols to alphasols and even entosols along the sequence. And so with Randy's help, my student Samuel retraced the sites, and Randy provided wonderful support that I should acknowledge here. He was in Samuel's dissertation, thesis research committee, and we were able to trace the sites, collected 5 very different types of soils. And then we took those to the lab and decided to put them at a variety, to expose them to a variety of temperature conditions. And as we did that, we relied on work that had been done a long time ago to monitor how temperature profiles change in the soil system, in the top part of the soil profile, as a fire is moving through. So this is data that's collected when scientists put thermal temperature probes in the soil profile before fires, wildfires, and prescribed fire conditions. And then they let the fire burn, and they go on and collect the data to observe how high did the temperature reach in the soil. And this was just incredible. You can imagine how much time and energy it takes to develop these kinds of metrics. But what this basically shows you is that, we talk about fire severity as it applies to plant and vegetation burning and the temperature of the fires at the soil surface. And the temperature at the soil surface can reach 700 and even higher degrees Celsius in terms of temperature. But it's important to remember that soil is actually a very poor conductor of heat. So when that heat from the surface is moving down the soil profile, first of all, it takes time for even 2.5 centimeters below the soil surface to see high temperatures. But the highest temperature that the soil at 2.5 centimeters sees is considerably lower than the high temperatures that you see in the surface. And that's even more true for soils that are even a little deeper, 5 centimeters below the soil surface. The only time where this becomes different is if soils are actually wet when they're burning. But if there is water in the soil when the forest is burning, then that heat can propagate rather fast and deep. But keep in mind that if the soil and forest floor are wet, by definition, it probably also means that the vegetation also has a little bit of moisture, so it won't burn as intensely to start with, right? But you get the idea. So we decided that a temperature range that covers something like 100 to about 650 is a good approximation for what the conditions the soil sees as far as temperature is concerned. So we took all those soils from the western slope of the Sierra Nevada, we put them on a furnace in the lab and exposed them to these temperatures. And this is data on how the percent carbon concentration in the soils change when you expose the topsoils to different heat temperatures, right? And what I want you to focus is how similar the pattern of carbon loss with from soil is when you increase the temperature. And I also want you to observe that the steepest decline in percent carbon is associated with soils that had the highest percent carbon. And by the time soils are exposed to about 450 degrees centigrade heat, they lose close to about 95% of the surface soil carbon that they had in these surface layers. That's a pretty consistent pattern that you could see here. And then we also did test on aggregate stability. How stable are the aggregates after they're exposed to the heat? And as you could see here, the pattern's also roughly consistent, right? There's a steep decline in aggregate stability that occurs, at about after about 350 degrees C. But beyond that, the pattern's kind of rather similar. And another thing that we've learned, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here but there was another student at UC Merced, Matthew Jan, who did an incredible environmental physics project to demonstrate how aggregate stability at low temperature fire conditions can be, aggregate stability can be reduced. And one of the things he's learned is this is also dependent on how much moisture you have inside the aggregates as the soils are being exposed to high temperatures. Because historically, we had assumed that at low temperature conditions, below 250 or so, there's really no impact on aggregate stability. But what his work showed is that actually that's not necessarily true. Soil aggregate stability can experience change and some destabilization, as is evident in particular, for example, in this one and the music soils, that it could occur, you could have loss of aggregate stability if the soils had a bit of water inside the aggregates, because what happens is when that's exposed to high temperature, then the water that's inside the aggregate starts turning into vapor, right? It's heating. Some of it turns into vapor. The vapor pressure inside the aggregate space increases, and the vapor pressure that is created inside could actually be, depending on the soils you have and how much water you have there, obviously, but the vapor pressure buildup could be enough to destabilize and cause breakdown of aggregates. But generally speaking, you notice again that rather steep change in water stable aggregate that occurred, especially after 350 degrees C. And then we did this rather time-consuming fractionation experiment to determine, okay, so you've seen all that carbon that was lost in the previous slide, and you saw that by 450 degrees C, almost all the carbon was lost from the soil. So we reconstructed during this experiment, then where is the carbon that's remaining in the soil at the different times? So this is, all of it is to 100%, because now we're only calculating from the carbon that's still remaining in the soil, what proportion of it is in larger aggregates, which are obviously weaker, but can promote stabilization of soil? What proportion of it is in these smaller fractions in micro aggregates and chemically bound to soil surfaces in the silt and size clay fraction? And the reason why that is important is that we wanted to highlight that a lot of the carbon, especially in soils like we have in the Sierra, the core soils, a lot of the carbon is in aggregates that are formed in the soil, because some of these soils outside this mid-elevation zone in particular don't actually have a lot of clay, because soil development's limited by it being super dry at the low elevation and super cold in the high elevation. So we wanted to demonstrate that where the carbon that remains was. And you could see quite clearly how there is rather rapid reduction, in particular after 250 degrees C, of the amount of carbon that's in the larger aggregates, and the remaining carbon largely is then in those really fine fractions at about 450 degrees C. Okay, so we saw that aggregates can be destabilized, carbon can be associated with, the remaining carbon be associated with just with the finer fractions in soil. And then we moved on to look into how fire and thermal, heat treatment affected the nature of the organic matter that could be leached out of soil and reach streams in dissolved form. And I'm not using dissolved, I'm saying water extractable here again, because this is material we extracted in the lab from the soil. But to be able to look at the chemistry, we needed to first examine, kind of develop and adopt a method to be able to allow us to do this, because there was really no good technique to look into how the chemistry of this pool of dissolved organic matter was changing in a matter that did not include, harsh chemical extractants. So what we did was we adopted a method that a lot of folks, including Andre Simpson and others, had developed for water in streams and other places. We adopted this technique to work for soil extracted organic matter too. And one of the wonderful things that this allows you to do is, so you extract, first of all, the water extractable organic matter using cold water extraction, then you freeze dry the solution so that you remove all the water and you resuspend the organic matter that's in the soil using deuterated or D2O. So this is isotope enriched water. And the reason why this is a useful step is because this technique relies on proton NMR, which is a nuclear magnetic resonance technique that evaluates the magnetic environment where a nuclei find themselves in, and it allows us to find, kind of what the magnetic or chemical environment looks like. But if you're using hydrogen as the element to the nuclei that you're focusing in here, water becomes a problematic issue because water is full of hydrogen, right? So we take out all the H1s and we replace them by H2, this isotopically enriched water, and then that allows us to constrain all the water to one region in the spectra, and we could just subtract that out and then try to interpret what the other information we get here is. And what this then allows us to do is, once we have the spectra of the sample, we can then integrate under each of these regions to determine what proportion of the carbon that's in the sample is made out of these different types of organic functional groups. In particular, for our study, we are interested in figuring out what proportion of the total carbon is in this aromatic pool. Remember, pyrogenic carbon is these condensed aromatic structures, right? And because the only thing that changed during this extraction is that we exposed it to heat, we can comfortably contribute any change in the peak area of this region to accumulation of aromatic carbon. But I should mention that if you do not have fire, this signal could be derived from things like lignin too, because it's just a signal for aromatic compounds. So I won't make you focus on all of this, but just to give you an idea, we run this experiment on all the soils across the sequence after they were exposed to multiple temperature treatments. And then we zoomed in what proportion of the carbon then shows up in the aromatic region at different times. And you could see some clear patterns of story start to emerge here, was that when the soils are exposed to heating, starting actually at about 150 degrees C, we see dissolution and depolymerization of large organic functional groups that show up in this dissolved pool. We see clear evidence of thermal decomposition of carbohydrates and proteins. We also see increased contribution of dissolved pyrogenic organic matter to the soil solution, in particular at 350 degrees C. And we noticed that the high elevation forest soils in particular were more sensitive to thermal transformations even at lower temperature before we reached the 350 degrees C. So we saw the conditions that would create dissolvable water extractable carbon that could be mobilized. And then we try to quantify, okay, we wanted to see this in a practical field setting where wildfires are creating erosion. And in some ways, this is an exercise in timing. Right after I submitted my NSF proposal for this work, the Rimfire happened. And when the Rimfire happened and we were nearby, we decided, even before we found out the result of that funding from NSF, that we were going to sample the site anyway, because it created very similar conditions to what we proposed. And it was right next to our backyard. Some of you would remember that the Rimfire at the time had burned, over 250,000 acres of land. It was one of the largest fires in California history, especially at the time. But remember, California fires keep breaking their record every year. And it occurred, across the Yosemite National Park, the green here, and the Stanislaus National Forest. It was fast moving. It captured everybody's attention. It was affecting some iconic landscapes. And one of the things that was super clear in the proposal that we made and in our findings is that, obviously fires create all of these different types of pyrogenic carbon. And we know that, if you go back into these areas sometime later, that material is transported. It doesn't stay there. You don't find all that char that was on the surface after the fires if you go back even a few months later. And about a year and some later, the landscape actually starts to recover. So we ask questions then, what controls how much and to what degree this pyrogenic carbon is going to be removed from the soil surface? Is it slope of the landscape? Is it fire severity? These are two variables we can ask and test with the data that we had with this site that we had. And we had wonderful collaborators at the National Park Service that we worked with for this, because remember, the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service, they go into these fire affected areas rather quickly. They assess the damage, they map fire severity, they develop all sorts of data. And we have wonderful collaborators that I should give a lot of credit for here, that were able to reconstruct the fire severity and its distribution across the study system. We also had really good information on slope. So this allowed us then to choose sites that we can monitor over the year after the Rimfire, where we can vary both the fire severity and the slope. So we selected 7 sites that were burned at high severity, but also had high slope. We selected another 7 sites within this area that had high severity with a bit high severity fire, but moderate slope. And then another 7 sites with moderate severity fire, but were located at high slope. And in each of these 21 sites, we put in these sediment fences that were cleared either monthly or after every major precipitation event, because precipitation is seasonal. And that then will allow us to determine how much mass was mobilized in these different areas, and we can then characterize the nature of the sediment too. So what you basically see in this data is this is right after the snow melts and the major precipitation events start happening in the area. Rainfall events is what we're talking about right now. We could see how much sediment gets mobilized. So most of the highest rate of transport occurs with the first rain events, right? With the first major rain events, especially in the high severity area that now lacks vegetation protection. And we also see in our data that the high rates of soil carbon erosion occur from this high severity areas that are burned by high severity, regardless of the slope of the landscape. So slope seems to be a secondary controlling variable. The first major variable that's important seems to be fire severity. But then again, remember, we're interested in isolating how much pyrogenic carbon is in the system. So we used another nuclear magnetic resonance technique, this time a solid state technique that uses the 13T nuclei in this cross polarization magic angle spinning NMR technique. And in a similar fashion, like I showed you with proton NMR, when you expose your sample to a dynamic magnetic field, the nuclei, the 13C nuclei, resonate in the magnetic field, depending on what kind of magnetic environment they're surrounded in. So basically, it means they resonate differently if a carbon is bound to another carbon or hydrogen, or if it has a double bond or a ring structure. And over years and years of work, chemists have been able to give us an idea of what the spectra would look like, depending on the chemical composition of the material you're spinning in this nuclear magnetic resonance system, or you refer to as the magnets. And I want you to focus, for the data that I'm going to show you, first of all, on these two regions. So the first peak here is a peak that is for saturated aliphatics, things like lipids and waxes. But the next two peaks here are associated with substituted aliphatics, including things like simple carbohydrates, cellulosic materials, simple proteins, and things like that are associated with fresh biomass, fresh foliage in particular, right? And then the peaks that show up at about 130 and 50 are more of this aromatic structures. In particular, around 130 is used to identify char. And so I want you to see how this dominates in some of the samples post-fire, in the post-fire environment that I'm presenting right now. So what you're seeing here then are the NMR spectra for the topsoil after the fire, and then the sediments that were transported from there in the beginning and the end of the growing season, of the rainy season, right? So what you see very clearly is that there's a lot of pyrogenic carbon in the soil surface after the fire. No surprise necessarily, right? But the sediment that's transported, though, is really, really even more enriched in the pyrogenic carbon. And this also was verified that the transported material in the high severity burn areas was super enriched, even based on 15N measurements. So we could see clear evidence that pyrogenic carbon is being selectively transported. So we wanted to ask questions about, okay, so why is this happening, but also how does it determine the fate of the pyrogenic carbon? And I'm going to quickly give you a couple of lines of evidence of what we see. First of all, what we see is that, when I put the data from NMR with other elemental data in a molecular mixing model, I'm able to estimate the proportion of pyrogenic carbon in my samples. And immediately after the fire, somewhere about 35 to 55% of all the carbon in topsoil is pyrogenic. But if I monitor the concentration of pyrogenic carbon in the sediments that are transported, though, especially in the high elevation area, it is highly enriched in pyrogenic carbon. So clearly pyrogenic carbon is selectively being transported away in the high elevation areas. And this makes sense, right? There's not much vegetation cover to protect the ground surface. Erosion is enhanced in high severity areas, and all the carbon is charred. So it's available right there for transport. But in the low and medium severity areas, that's not necessarily true. And this is particularly unique to some conifer forest ecosystems that shed their needle after fire. So the plants that didn't burn shed new organic matter into the surface. So there's a lot relatively new organic matter that has not charred on the surface, and that seems to be dominantly what gets transported. But generally speaking, this amounts to, the data we monitored, something like 3,000 to 5,000 megagrams of charred pyrogenic matter that's eroded in the first year after the fire from the moderate and high severity burn areas. That's a lot of char. It has a lot of health implications that we can't get into right now. And my incredible longtime colleague, Carrie Masiello, has done some incredible work in this space to demonstrate why Pi-C is selectively transported. And her lab has documented all sorts of data and studies to show that pyrogenic carbon is low in density, it's light. And so if you put it in a water column with sand, or if you expose it to water, it rather rapidly floats, rises to the top, and just gets transported quite easily. And Rebecca, my former student, did a long-term decomposition study to determine, first of all, how fast this Pi-C moves, but also, does it matter for its decomposition, whether it's on top of the hill slope or down in the depositional setting? And she was able to demonstrate by measuring the Pi-C before and after the incubation that yes, pyrogenic carbon movement matters, because if it's transported to wetter, poorly drained depositional settings, it could actually experience rather rapid decomposition that could affect, obviously, its long-term patterns. And I don't have time to go through the modeling here, and I'm happy to explain it in questions. But what this amounted to when we plugged in the data into a rather simple first-order kinetic model to think about the fate of this pyrogenic carbon overall, is that the erosional transport of pyrogenic carbon actually becomes a major variable for removing Pi-C from hill slopes. So as a loss term for the hill slope where most of the fire is happening, and input term for pyrogenic matter input into lower lying depositional settings. And if we don't factor erosion as an important variable in our calculations when we do this, we introduce a significant amount of error in our estimates of the mean residence time of pyrogenic carbon. And the error that we introduce alone could be equivalent to about a third of our estimates of mean residence time of pyrogenic carbon. So in conclusion, I think we learned a lot over the years that, obviously there's multiple different mechanisms that cause destabilization of soil, i.e. erosion generation at high and low severity fire conditions. And that fire severity primarily controls the extent to which both dissolved and particulate carbon is going to be mobilized. In particular, because the first interaction of the hydrologic cycle or water with Pi-C occurs rather quickly with the time scale of days or weeks after fire, then it even supersedes microbial decomposition as the primary controlling variable for the fate of pyrogenic carbon compared to other biological mechanisms that come later. With that, I'll stop. Thank you all.
Fabian, we can't hear you, just so you know.
Oh, I figured.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry about that.
Okay.
All right, I will say it again. Thank you so much, Dr. Berhe, for your lecture today. It was extremely informative and just amazing the amount of research that you have been doing. And just please, everybody, if you could just join me in doing a virtual applause for Dr. Berhe. And thank you so much. And we have—
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. We have a little bit of time for questions. What we are going to do now is have a few questions, and then we will transition to a little bit more of an informal Q&A and just time to chat. But let's start with a few questions that people may have. And so the microphone will be available. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. And I would invite you to be brief in your question, please. Another option is if you want to type a question, you can do that in the chat.
Yeah, I can open my chat so that I could see the comments too.
Let me begin. I guess I can ask a quick question first. So, there's been a lot of talk about control fires as a way to manage this kind of increasing problem that we are seeing with fires. And I was wondering, from a soils perspective, what are some of the things that people that plant these control fires should be looking at in order to protect the soil environment?
I think so. The aggregate destabilization work that I presented from Matthew Jan and others has demonstrated quite significantly how we need to be careful about, Forest Service and National Park Service folks would tell you that this is really important anecdotally, for example, right? They're really careful about what conditions they're burning under. Part of this is because they don't want the prescribed burn to get out of hand, obviously. But part of it is also to think about the health of the ecosystem. Many of these forest ecosystems depend on fire for their health, right? So fire is an important part of their development. But I think what we're learning is that we need to be really careful about under what conditions that fire happens so that we don't induce additional destabilization of the soil structure. And a critical variable there seems to be how wet the soil is when the prescribed burns are happening. And so I think the work that we've done has highlighted, first of all, how we really need to be careful about soil conditions during prescribed burn, soil water status in particular, that determines, how that heat's going to propagate, what kind of impact it's going to have on soil properties, and just keeping the burn conditions to as low temperature as possible. Right, it's fire might be a necessary condition for clearing, lower understory vegetation, regeneration of seeds, and things like that. But high severity fire is quite problematic, in particular, for many reasons. So, that's also, I think, in many ways, I should say, the biggest concern with the current increase in severity of fires, right, is because these fires are not just burning like they used to. They are super destructive right now. Everybody in California obviously recognizes how incredible the destruction that's happening because of fires is. So, just a number of things we have to be to watch out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fabian, I got a question. Dr. Braid, could you tell us a little bit about the half-life of pyrogenic carbon? And is there any way to go back, going back to 1850s, there used to be a lot of wildfires. And to what extent we can find that carbon from those times?
So I'm glad you asked this question because I didn't get a chance to go into the details of the mean turnover rate or times for pyrogenic carbon. So historically, there was an assumption that pyrogenic carbon, by virtue of it being made out of these condensed aromatic structures, actually must be inert. Then we learned, not really. Under the right environmental conditions, microbes could decompose it. And so some of the estimates that we had for mean residence time of pyrogenic carbon in soil was about 10, 12,000 years. But the latest estimates that we have is actually something between 300 to 600 years. And so keep in mind that it doesn't mean that pyrogenic carbon can't persist for long periods of time. It just means that under optimal conditions, it could decompose on the order of about a few hundred years. But pyrogenic carbon can persist for tens of thousands and even longer years if it finds itself in stabilizing conditions. So if it finds itself inside aggregate spaces, very deep in soil, where there's limitation for oxygen or resources that microbes need to decompose it. So in fact, we're working in a site in Nebraska with collaborators at University of Wisconsin, where there is a layer from the fires that occurred during the early Holocene period. There is a layer of about a meter deep layer of a buried paleosol that's buried about 6 meters below the soil surface. And it's a lot of carbon is in this buried paleosol, and a big proportion of that carbon is actually pyrogenic carbon. And this pyrogenic carbon persisted for, by the radiocarbon dating that they did, something like 12,000 years, because it was buried under these rather dry conditions in Nebraska, in the sandhills in Nebraska. And there was not much water, there was not much microbial activity. So as a result, it was able to just sit there for long periods of time. And that is a kind of like a wonderful marker for tracing past environmental conditions, right? So there's a lot of, so under optimal environmental conditions, we could clearly see now that it can decompose fast in a few hundred years. But if the environmental conditions, are ones that are not conducive for microbes to conducted decomposition, then it could persist for rather long periods of time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question.
Hey.
I'm curious if we know anything about how pre-fire ecosystem health or pre-fire soil health might affect how much pyrogenic carbon is created, the erosion of it, anything like that.
So technically, you need carbon in soil to create pyrogenic carbon, right? So so the amount of carbon that you have in the soil and even its composition in some ways determines how much pyrogenic carbon is likely to be developed after the fires. And also what kind of pyrogenic carbon and what chemical properties and physical properties it might have, because there's a number of studies that clearly show that pyrogenic carbon created at different temperature conditions and when there's different availability of oxygen for pyrolysis actually have very different chemical composition, and they also have very different fates. Johannes Lehmann and others had done quite a lot of really, really incredible work over the years on this to demonstrate how fire conditions, feedstock, and many really, even you all have Kurt's focus in here, right, in your institution, and so you know there's so much work in this space that people have done to demonstrate how the nature amount of carbon that you start with, be it on vegetation or soil, topsoil material that's exposed to fire, determines quite a number of important properties and fate of that pyrogenic carbon. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you for the questions. As I mentioned, we have another about half hour for more of an informal discussion with Asmeret. So if you would like to
there is a question in the chat, but I think it was sent only to me, so I can answer it if you prefer.
Sure, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, we can continue this. I just want to mention before we answer the question that remind everyone that at 3 p.m. using this same Zoom room, there will be another talk from Asmeret. She will be talking about diversity and equity. And I would encourage all of us to join at that time as well. So, Diana Kerwin will be taking over for the informal portion of the question and answer or discussion until about 12:45 Central Time. And then after that, the graduate students will be meeting with Asmeret also to have a time to discuss things with her. So thank you, everybody. Yeah. And again, thank you, especially to the Larsen and Almaraz families for their support and for being here today.
Yeah. So do you want me to answer? There's another question that was just sent too. So I can start.
Diana is in charge from now on, but I think that would be great if you can answer those questions. Yes.
Yeah. So the first question from Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. Is about Pi-C and how its abundance and concentration depends, varies throughout the soil profile, and how deep do you find it. And so there's actually pyrogenic carbon that myself and our projects and many other folks have found in deep soil layers. Part of this is because it depends on, first of all, how fine the Pi-C is or how much biotubation there is in the environment after fires to mix the Pi-C that would have been near the top in the beginning with deep soil layers. And of course, over time with transport, with erosion, Pi-C that would have been on top of the hill slopes gets buried and deposited in floodplains and colluvial and alluvial depositional settings quite regularly too. So people find Pi-C at all different levels and depths in the soil. We had this really interesting work at the South Lake Tahoe in the site that was burned by a fire in 2002. And when I started my job at UC Merced in 2009, I happened to be part of the critical zone observatory, and Dale Johnson, who's this phenomenal soil scientist who spent an incredible career at UNR, University of Nevada, Reno, was working in South Lake Tahoe, and he was also part of our critical zone observatory. And I got to know Dale, and when he realized that I was asking questions of pyrogenic carbon erosion, he said, "You should come out in South Lake Tahoe, and I'll show you some of our sites, because because we have, samples from right before the fire happened, because they were instrumenting the site for a study, and then the wildfire moved through, and him and a couple of other folks at UNR at the time thought very quickly and said, the study might have changed, but this is still incredibly valuable site. So they went back 2 weeks after the fire and resampled the same spots. And so he had archived also all the samples from the pre-fire and post-fire. He was nearing retirement, and he gave us, my student and I, all his samples and all the information that he had. And then he helped us retrace his sites, and we sampled 10 years after the fire. So we now have data to show what happened right before the fire, 2 weeks after the fire, and 10 years after the fire. And when we look at the soil profile of Pisces in all those sites, we clearly see a pattern of Pisces moving down. And we did a rough back of the envelope calculation at the time that suggested that in those high elevation Sierra soils, poor sandy soils, but had a lot of carbon that turned into Pisces, Pisces was vertically moving down the soil profile at about 5 centimeters per year. Or at least it moved to about 50 centimeters at some point and stopped. But at 10 years, that's where we found a lot of it anyway. So quite interesting, but then again, you realize it's a lot of colloidal material. So if water moving down in these sandy soils, there's no reason why it shouldn't move down with the water. So yeah, it's a lot of really interesting mechanisms by which Pisces could be entering deep soils. The other question from Jim asked about, that's an interesting, he says he read a recent study that biochar in Amazonia may have been naturally generated from deposition of pyrogenic carbon in floods, based partly on radiocarbon dating, finding that the biochar predates human occupation of the region. What might account for the high persistence of carbon in Amazonian soils? This is a fascinating area, right? A lot of the motivation and interest of pyrogenic carbon is one of the background stories that I didn't get a chance to go to, starts from what we know about the terra preta soils in the Amazonia, the dark earth soils. And these dark earth soils are believed to have been products or results of communities in Amazonia, native communities, burying litter, excess biomass from the forest and burning it in the soil. And as it burns, it creates Pisces, and they bury it. And that helps to increase their fertility, soil and nutrient water holding capacity, and makes their soils productive. And so there's a lot of interest on Amazonian dark earth and pyrogenic carbon dynamics because of that. But to me, what Jim is stating in his comment makes a lot of sense, right? There were fires in the area even before people went in there. And as I showed you in the studies that we've done in the Sierra Nevada, then the pyrogenic carbon, when there's erosion, moves downward. And if it finds itself in a depositional environment at a floodplain or a colluvial plain, especially floodplain in places like Amazonia, where you have a lot of water anyway to mobilize material from the topsoil, then there's no reason why it shouldn't be in those soils. And in those soils, you have large amounts of reactive minerals that will actually facilitate slower decomposition of the pyrogenic carbon. So it will be retained for long, long periods of time. So I wouldn't be surprised that a big part of the story that we're able to reconstruct from Amazonian dark earth soils is because of erosional redistribution of Pisces and its persistence in those highly weathered soils. Yeah. And then there's Amy posted a question, another one from Paul. Diana, you probably see that.
Yeah, do you want me to read the question out for everyone?
Whatever you prefer. Yeah, I'm okay either way.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone can see it. The question posed is, there's a major focus on increasing soil sequestration of carbon through management. With fast decomposition of Pisces being hundreds of years, what does your work imply for an artificial increase in the soil carbon pool?
Yeah, I think this is a very timely question, and this is part of the reason why there's a lot of interest around biochar as a soil amendment that can contribute to carbon sequestration, right? Because biochar virtually is Pi-C that we create intentionally, right? And slightly different conditions than wildfire conditions, obviously, for its creation, but it's essentially the same thing. And as a result, there's a number of studies and quite a lot of quantification in this space to demonstrate that if we are in ecosystems that have a lot of excess biomass, and this if is an important one, right? Because if we're not in ecosystems that have a lot of excess biomass, then we would be taking away residue that would have been returned to soil from mulching and replenishing nutrients. But if we have a lot of excess biomass, then charring some of it and returning the char to the soil contributes in a positive way to improving the soil's productivity, which eventually translates into improving sequestration potential of carbon. And by some accounts, there's about something like 1.2, 1.3 petagrams of CO2 equivalent we could sequester globally with the use of biochar in ecosystems where it's appropriate to do so.
Thanks. I don't see any other questions.
There is a question on private from Jennifer. I could read it. So she asks,
I can't see it.
no worries, it's a private direct message. The question is really important one. When you touched on prescribed burns earlier, I wondered if you've collaborated with Indigenous nations and their cultural burning practices in your work, and if so, whether how that's impacted questions you've asked and how you've approached your data. Unfortunately, I've never had the privilege of working with Indigenous nations on this kinds of questions. The sites that we've worked in have typically been National Park Service and Forest Service lands where, so we're working on kind of more management questions related to what these federal agencies were trying to implement in different areas. Of course, that involves lengthy consultation with all stakeholders, including Indigenous communities, but that was not something I could say we took any significant part in. But I recognize how important these discussions are, because and how in many cases what we're advocating after many years of doing the science is that there's a lot we could learn if we just actually thought about and consulted with Native communities in terms of why they were doing the management practices that they were doing, because they might have arrived at it by trial and error, because obviously they didn't have the science to guide them at the time they were doing that, but they still arrived at some pretty incredible management practices that contribute positively to environmental health overall. So I recognize the importance of doing that. I just wanted to say that.
Thanks. I want to allow time. I know we're at the lunch hour for those of us in the central time zones, and we're getting more questions as well. I just want to make sure sometime between now and 12:45, when Asmeret graciously works with the graduate students, that we give her a few minutes of break in here as well for some fluid mass balance. And allow any of the grad students to grab their lunches and things like that. So I just will be holding time for that. But the questions just keep rolling in. So Asmeret, are you good to keep going? Do you need to stand up, move around? I know everybody,
we're okay. We're okay, don't worry.
Okay, great, thanks. So let's see, we have a question from Jason. What role do the shallow aquifers and or groundwaters play in the Pi-C dynamics? And I particularly like this question and probably have a follow-up to it as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, I mean, as I showed you, if Pi-C moves both in dissolved and particulate form with colloidal mobilization vertically downward, then some of it is making it into groundwater systems. But I told you how our quantification of the transport side of things for Pi-C has been super limited until recently. We know even less about what's going on in the groundwater systems. I mean, to my knowledge, this had not been an area that people had focused in historically. And so we know a lot about what's going on in soil and ocean, both dissolved and particulate in the ocean and the atmosphere, than we do about groundwater systems. But whenever you have shallow aquifers and shallow groundwater systems, though, you can imagine that as the fires, redirect hydrologic flow regimes, that's going to have an important influence on recharge for groundwater systems. But I don't know that I could say anything more than that, to be honest with you. This is an area that I feel like we know even less about. At least definitely I know less about. There might be folks out there whose work I don't know enough about. And thank you, Anna, for that comment. Anna writes, that was the best description of NMR she's heard. I just try to make it quick because without going into the details of the chemistry, and I'm really glad to hear you appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks. I want to follow up on a question about the water, because it's not just thinking about infiltration to shallow aquifers and groundwater, but if Pi-C is so light and so erodible, that surface waters sink in peace. And this is something I know sources of organic carbon has been a part of your work as well. And so I want to know what your thoughts are on Pi-C and that rivers piece. So between the terrestrial landscape and the coasts.
Yeah, so there's been a number of folks studying streams in a range of different ecosystems at this point and quantifying how much Pi-C is arriving at streams and how it's getting processed in streams too, just like the other carbon sources. And obviously it's a little less biologically available source of carbon, if you will, for transformation, but eventually over time, as it stays in the water system, in the aquatic systems, it tends to contribute to quite a significant amount of carbon released into the streams and also from streams to the atmosphere. Again, this has not really been the area that I've worked in. My work stops where Diana's work picks up for the most part, but I think people like Rob Spencer and others had even systems. They've even did the global synthesis, and of course Tim Eglinton's group at ETH has done a number of really phenomenal global and regional projects to also determine what's happening in streams. I've never really worked in those kinds of systems, but it's clear that we had underestimated how much pyrogenic carbon was going into streams in previous studies. They're getting better accounting and better also understanding of the mechanisms that facilitate Pi-C to move from land to the ocean, what happens to it once it arrives to the streams and then eventually the ocean, and what happens to it as far as the stream processing is concerned. So I think I would have to defer to Tim and Rob and folks in that space for more on that kind of information.
Thanks, but recognizing it's connected.
Yeah, totally connected. Yes, totally connected.
Yeah, thanks. I don't see any more questions in the chat on my end, but I can't spy on your chat, Asmeret.
No, I think we got all the ones on my end. Thank you all.
Yes. Other questions? No.
Asmeret, just a quick comment. Your talk today reminded me of I'm a soil fertility person, but I worked a little bit in soil carbon and fires, doing some work with miscanthus in Japan. And so your talk brought a lot of memories of that work. And I was wondering, that was fascinating to me to see these semi-natural systems where people have been burning the natural grasslands for centuries, millennia, actually. And wondering if you have done work in that space with natural grasses that obviously, they burn a lot faster and probably not as hot, maybe as hot, but just very, very quick. They move really quick. It will be very different, I suspect, a very different situation compared to like forest fires. I don't know if you have any work that you've done on that or any thoughts that you may have on that respect.
Yeah, I've not personally worked on grassland fires, but you're 100% correct. It's, fires are pretty prevalent in grassland ecosystems around the world. And the couple of really interesting distinctions is that, obviously grasses have a lot of cellulosic material in, most of these types of ecosystems in savannas have a lot more cellulosic material than woody material on the on top of the ground surface. So when they burn, they tend to burn at a slightly lower temperature, first of all. And of course, intense fires are, kind of possible under both conditions, forest or grassland, but generally speaking, burn at slightly lower temperature. And because of the nature of the residue that's burning, it also tends to produce pyrogenic carbon that tends to be less stable or less persistent in the soil system. And so there's a lot faster, basically, reworking of the pyrogenic carbon and its cycling in the soil system in more of the grassland systems. But some of the Pi-C persists even in deeper soil layers, even in grasslands, partly because the grasses, they have this extensive, amazing root systems, right? So if somehow Pi-C makes it into soil, it gets reworked with biotubation and is relocated into deep soil layers where it could persist for long, long periods of time. But grassland fires are an incredibly fascinating area of study in itself.
Anyway, I just was wondering, and again, it brought a lot of great memories from that time, from that work, and it was a lot of fun, and it's quite amazing that they do these controlled fires just to maintain the grasslands. That part of the world.
Yeah, a lot of, slash and burn is very common in, kind of different types of ecosystems like that, right? As is in many other, to be fair. Yeah.
Also thinking about transitions between forests and grasslands and what we may be facing in the future with biome shifting.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of that happening and worries of, initially at least to shrublands, but so a lot of the forests that burned in the Sierra Nevada in the last few years, there's a bit of concern whether they would actually go back to the forests that they were before the massive forest die-off, before the massive droughts and fires that occurred in the region, right? Because the climatic conditions under which these forests developed was very different than we're dealing with right now. And so ecologically speaking, we might be looking at a regime shift, at least towards shrubs and not necessarily grasses, but shift towards shrubs from these kind of incredible dynamic forest ecosystems that we had in the region. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank, I still have like 3 screens of folks on Zoom. So this attests to how interesting your topic is and how engaging of a speaker you are, Asmeret.
Oh, thank you. Obviously I care about this topic. And it's fascinating. I've tried to distill it down to tidbit here from and there. It's always a challenge because, but I'm glad you all appreciate that.
Yeah, I want to open it up for others to engage and ask questions. Either just raise your hand, if you can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you, or put something in the chat. We have time for a few more.
At least I'll say hello. I see Anna and Brett, and I see some familiar names in the list. and Jen Powers, obviously. I said hello earlier. Zoom is weird. Zoom is super, super weird.
If we have time to chat about other topics before the grad students take over, Asmeret, I really enjoyed hearing about your recent nomination to the Department of Energy. Do you want to say anything about that?
Thanks, Amy. I just say it's been quite an honor, as you can imagine. It's new. It's still obviously a lot of processing happening, but it's I consider it, to be honest, an honor, not just for me to the recognition, but the value of soil science and the value of earth science in general, that it's finally, I feel like it's receiving the attention and the credit that it deserves, the community. And of course, it's not lost on me that I'm an earth scientist from a minority serving institution that is being nominated to run the largest funding agency for energy and physical science in the US. That represents a fundamental shift in how we've been treating science and the hierarchy that we had established for the different sciences and different types of institutions in academia over the years. So, I'm blown away. I honestly didn't think it was real when I first got the email about a month ago. I think I mentioned it to some of you. It's like, oh, this was not something, many of you know that I actually like being a professor and I enjoyed my role. So I never sought out this kind of activities, but I'd always been, obviously passionate in some of the topics that I care about, soil and addressing climate change being one of them, earth science education, and especially equity and inclusion. And I'm just really glad that those are the kind of things that the Biden administration is interested in highlighting and recognizing. So just huge honor.